The letter arrived on a bright Monday morning with an official-looking envelope. I tore it open and immediately froze at the words printed inside. The HOA had fined me $250,000 for supposed violations on my property. I read the list of infractions over and over, each one more ridiculous than the last. They claimed my landscaping was not compliant, my fence was too tall, and my paint color did not match their standards. I laughed out loud, knowing full well that my property was perfectly within legal limits. But the HOA was not used to being challenged, and they assumed I would panic and pay without question. I decided to call their office to discuss the matter calmly. The receptionist tried to sound polite, but there was an edge of arrogance in her voice. I explained that I wanted to review the details of the fine and see if we could resolve it. After a short hold, I was transferred to the head of the HOA, a woman named Karen. Karen spoke sharply, claiming that their rules were clear and that the fine would stand unless I complied immediately. I smiled and asked her to hold on while I pulled up my property documents. Minutes later, I had her attention as I calmly explained that I did not just own my property. I owned the entire block, including every house in the neighborhood governed by her HOA. There was silence on the other end of the line as the weight of my words sank in. Karen stammered, trying to regain control, but it was too late. I could hear the office around her bustling in confusion as staff realized what she had just revealed. Suddenly, the conversation changed from threats to awkward pauses and hesitant questions. I explained that I had every intention of following the law, but their arbitrary fines had no standing against the truth. Karen went pale and offered no further resistance. The arrogance and authority she had wielded so easily moments ago had evaporated in an instant. I could feel the power shift, and it was exhilarating to see them realize who truly controlled the neighborhood. As the call ended, I leaned back in my chair with a calm satisfaction, knowing that their silence was louder than any apology could be. After hanging up the phone, I walked outside onto my property. The sun reflected off the perfectly manicured lawns and the fences standing tall and proud. Neighbors walked by waving as if nothing had happened, unaware of the storm that had just passed. I knew the HOA meetings that week would be tense, filled with awkward glances and hushed conversations. Karen and her staff would try to regain their composure, but the reality of the situation had already sunk in. No amount of rules or fines could erase the truth that I owned the land. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing my property boundaries and documents, making sure everything was in perfect order. It was almost ironic how their aggression had made them forget who held the real power. Later that day, I received another call from Karen, this time quieter, more tentative. She tried to negotiate a resolution or at least save face, but I could hear the hesitation in her voice. I calmly reminded her that I expected respectful communication and adherence to actual laws, not arbitrary threats. Her words stumbled and trailed off as she realized that any attempt to intimidate me would only highlight their mistake. I ended the call with a polite reminder that the neighborhood was mine, and any further action needed to be reasonable and lawful. As I set down the phone, I felt a rare satisfaction, knowing that the tables had turned completely. The HOA that had once tried to control me with fines and rules was now forced to act with caution and respect. And as I looked around the neighborhood, I realized that power was not in their documents or meetings, it was in ownership and the quiet confidence to enforce it. The rest of the week passed with an unusual calm over the neighborhood. Meetings were postponed and emails went unanswered as Karen and her board struggled to regain control. I watched from my porch as the usual chatter of complaints and notices had vanished. Even the neighbors who had been vocal about HOA rules seemed unsure how to act around me now. It was clear that my ownership had shifted the balance of power without a single confrontation. I received messages from a few board members cautiously asking for guidance on minor issues now that they realized who truly owned the land. I responded politely but firmly, making it clear that respect and legal compliance were non-negotiable. Each interaction was a reminder that authority is not in shouting or threatening, but in having the facts and standing by them. By the weekend, the neighborhood felt different, as if a silent understanding had spread among the residents. Even casual greetings carried a new respect, and the former tension of fines and rules seemed almost comical in retrospect. I walked through the streets inspecting fences and landscaping not because of any real concern, but to enjoy the control and clarity that ownership brought. And as the sun set behind the houses, I felt a sense of satisfaction and calm knowing that the neighborhood was mine and that the HOA had learned a lesson they would not soon forget. Monday morning arrived with an unusual quiet over the neighborhood. I stepped outside to check the mail and noticed that the HOA signs that once posted warnings and rules had been quietly removed. Neighbors waved from their driveways, their smiles a little more genuine than before, and their conversations lighter. Even Karen approached me cautiously, her usual confidence replaced by careful politeness. She cleared her throat and said, "We just wanted to make sure everything is in order now that you own the block." I nodded calmly, assuring her that all my properties were in compliance and that respectful communication was appreciated. Her eyes flicked nervously to the surrounding houses before she mumbled a brief thank you and walked away. The silence of the streets felt powerful, almost surreal. For years, I had lived under the constant hum of HOA scrutiny. Now that it was gone, the neighborhood felt open and free. I took a long walk past the homes, noting small improvements and planning future projects, knowing that I had the final say. The residents greeted me differently now, with respect, not fear. Even the gossip that used to circulate so quickly seemed subdued as everyone adjusted to the reality that I was in control. By afternoon, the neighborhood had settled into a peaceful rhythm, a sharp contrast to the tension of the previous week. And as I returned to my porch with a cup of coffee, I realized that true authority comes not from rules or threats, but from quiet confidence and undeniable ownership. As evening fell, I sat on my porch watching the golden light reflect off the rooftops and lawns. The streets were calm, and the usual noise of complaints and disputes had vanished completely. Neighbors who once avoided me now waved warmly and offered small nods of acknowledgement. Even Karen drove slowly past my house, her expression cautious and measured, as if she were testing the boundaries of her own authority. I sipped my coffee quietly, knowing that the events of the past week had changed the neighborhood forever. The HOA that had tried to assert control with fines and rules was now reduced to a cautious observer. Their attempts at intimidation had backfired spectacularly, leaving them aware of who truly held the power. I leaned back in my chair, letting the cool evening breeze wash over me, and felt a rare sense of satisfaction. It was not the money or the houses that mattered most, but the acknowledgement of authority and the respect that came with it. As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, the neighborhood settled into a peaceful quiet. For the first time in years, I felt fully in control, knowing that I had faced arrogance and intimidation with calm and clarity. And as the stars began to twinkle above, I knew that this was only the beginning of a neighborhood finally governed by reason and fairness rather than fear. The next morning, I stepped outside to survey the neighborhood with fresh eyes. The streets were empty, but the sense of calm and order was unmistakable. I noticed small changes already taking place, homeowners tending to their yards with more care and pride. Even the previously strict rules posted by the HOA seemed to have disappeared entirely. Karen and a few board members walked past my property cautiously, exchanging glances as they pretended to conduct inspections. I waved politely, and they nodded stiffly, their previous arrogance completely gone. It was clear they were still adjusting to the new reality that I owned the land and that their power was no longer absolute. Throughout the day, neighbors approached with small questions or casual greetings, all delivered with a newfound respect. I answered each politely, but firmly reinforcing the idea that ownership came with responsibility and fairness. By evening, the neighborhood had settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and secure. The once tense energy that had permeated every meeting and email was replaced with quiet confidence. I walked along the sidewalks, inspecting fences and landscaping not because I had to, but because I wanted to enjoy the freedom that ownership brought. As the sun set, I realized that the neighborhood had transformed almost overnight. Not because of fines or threats, but because authority had been met with calm resolve and a clear understanding of who truly controlled the land. The following morning, I woke early and stepped outside to greet the day. The air was crisp, and the streets were quiet except for the soft hum of distant traffic. I walked past the houses, noting the subtle improvements and the care that homeowners were beginning to show. Even the gardens that had once been neglected now looked tidy and well-maintained. Karen drove slowly through the block again, her eyes flicking nervously to my house before she continued down the street. Her staff trailed behind her making notes, but there was a hesitation in their movements, as if they were unsure how to act. I waved casually and continued my walk, knowing that the power dynamic had shifted completely. Neighbors smiled as they passed by, some even stopping to ask questions about the properties or to offer greetings. It was a remarkable change from the tension and fear that had once filled the streets. By midday, the neighborhood had settled into a rhythm of calm and order. People worked on small projects, their conversations filled with curiosity and polite questions rather than complaints or challenges. I returned to my porch as the sun climbed high in the sky and sipped my coffee, quietly enjoying the sight of a neighborhood finally at peace. The lessons from the past week lingered in every interaction, a reminder that respect and calm authority carried far more weight than threats or fines. And as the day stretched into afternoon, I realized that the neighborhood I had always cared for was now thriving under the quiet strength of true ownership. As evening approached, I strolled along the quiet streets, watching the light fade over the rooftops. The neighborhood felt alive yet peaceful, with families tending to their yards and children playing safely on the sidewalks. Even the former tension in the air seemed to have vanished, completely replaced by a sense of respect and cautious optimism. Karen drove past slowly again, this time glancing at each house, as if measuring her own authority against the reality she could no longer control. I nodded politely as she passed and continued my walk, knowing that her attempts to assert dominance had been neutralized. Neighbors greeted me warmly from their porches, some pausing to chat briefly about improvements or maintenance. It was a new rhythm for the community, one built on recognition of ownership and fair conduct rather than fear. I paused at the corner to watch the sun sink behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lawns. The calm of the evening reinforced the lesson I had imparted without confrontation. By the time I returned to my porch, the stars were beginning to appear above the rooftops. The neighborhood was quiet but alive in a way that felt earned and deserved. And as I sat back with my coffee, I realized that the peace and respect now present would shape the community for years to come. The next morning, I woke early to the soft glow of sunlight spilling across the streets. The air was fresh and the neighborhood seemed even more alive than the day before. Homeowners moved about their yards, tending to gardens and fixing small repairs with a newfound sense of pride. Even Karen appeared briefly in her car, her expression careful and measured as she passed by. I waved casually, and she nodded stiffly before continuing down the block. It was clear that the power she once wielded with ease had evaporated completely. Neighbors began stopping to greet me as I walked along the sidewalk, asking questions about landscaping or sharing small updates about their homes. The energy of the neighborhood had transformed into one of quiet cooperation and mutual respect. Every interaction reminded me that authority backed by truth and calm resolve held far more weight than threats or fines. By midday, the streets hummed with activity, but it was a calm, organized kind of energy, unlike the tense chaos that had existed before. I returned to my porch with a cup of coffee, taking in the view of homes and lawns that reflected pride and care. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that the neighborhood had shifted permanently under the quiet strength of ownership. And as I sat back watching the residents move about their day, I realized that this was only the beginning of a community finally guided by respect and fairness. As the days turned into weeks, the neighborhood settled into a rhythm of calm and cooperation. Homeowners worked together on small projects and supported one another in ways that had never happened before. Even Karen and her board learned to navigate their roles with caution and respect, understanding that their authority was no longer absolute. I continued to walk the streets and tend to my properties, quietly observing the change that had taken place. Conversations were polite and collaborative, laughter replaced the tension that had once filled the air. The community had transformed not through confrontation but through clarity and the quiet assertion of ownership. And as I sat on my porch each evening watching the sun set over the rooftops, I felt a profound satisfaction. The neighborhood was finally at peace and thriving under fairness and respect. What had begun as a battle over fines had become a lasting lesson in authority, responsibility, and the power of standing firm. And in that moment, I knew the neighborhood would never be the same again.